I still remember the moment my family decided I was disposable, not because they said it out loud, but because of how casually they replaced me. It happened in the grand living room of our estate, the one with marble floors imported from Italy and chandeliers so heavy they looked like frozen rainstorms. Everyone was seated perfectly, as if rehearsed. My father sat at the head, expression carved from stone. My mother avoided my eyes. My uncles and aunts wore polite smiles that hid hunger. And standing beside them, dressed in a tailored suit that screamed borrowed confidence, was the man they had chosen to be the new heir. The fake heir. The one who carried our name but none of our blood. They expected fireworks from me. Tears. Rage. Desperation. They expected me to beg, because in their minds, losing their approval meant losing everything. What they didn't expect was my silence. For years, I had been raised to believe that legacy was loyalty and family was fate. I was the original successor, the son groomed to inherit an empire built on ruthless deals and polished lies. I learned numbers before nursery rhymes, contracts before bedtime stories. Yet the same people who taught me to be strong also taught me one fatal lesson: affection in wealthy families is conditional. The moment I stopped being convenient, I became invisible. When rumors spread that I wasn't ambitious enough, that I lacked my father's cruelty, they didn't defend me. They searched for a replacement. And they found him, an orphan they had sponsored years ago, reshaped, rebranded, and now presented as the future of the family. As my father announced his decision, the room held its breath. He spoke about vision, stability, and the importance of image. He praised the fake heir's obedience, his hunger, his willingness to do whatever it took. Every word was a blade meant to cut me open. I noticed how my cousins leaned forward, waiting for my collapse, how my aunt clutched her pearls as if bracing for a scene. They wanted proof that I needed them. They wanted to watch me unravel. Instead, I smiled. Not a bitter smile, not a forced one, just calm, measured, controlled. The kind of smile that doesn't ask for permission. That smile changed the atmosphere. Confusion replaced satisfaction. My father paused mid-sentence. The fake heir shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware that victory felt hollow without my defeat. I thanked my father for his honesty. I congratulated my replacement. I wished the family continued success. Each word landed softly, but the silence afterward was deafening. In that moment, I realized power wasn't about titles or inheritance. It was about detachment. They had spent years training me to be strategic, and now they were shocked to see I'd learned the lesson better than they expected. What they didn't know was that I had already grieved them long before that meeting. I had mourned the family I thought I had, the parents I believed would choose me. By the time they rejected me, there was nothing left to break. Calmness wasn't weakness, it was closure. While they thought I was walking away empty-handed, I was leaving with clarity. I saw them clearly for the first time, not as gods, not as gatekeepers of my worth, but as people terrified of losing control. As I stood to leave that room, I felt lighter than I ever had. Their empire, their approval, their cold love, it all stayed behind. And for the first time, I understood why they looked afraid. They had expected a broken heir. Instead, they created a free one. And freedom, when combined with patience, is far more dangerous than desperation. Leaving that mansion didn't feel like exile, it felt like escape. The gates closed behind me with a quiet finality, and for a moment, I stood there listening to the absence of noise. No chauffeurs rushing, no servants watching, no expectations hanging over my head like invisible chains. They thought I would return within days, humbled and desperate, ready to apologize for a crime I never committed. Wealthy families mistake dependence for loyalty, and they believed I depended on them. What they didn't understand was that I had been preparing for life without them long before they ever planned to replace me. I moved into a modest apartment across the city, the kind they would mock if they ever saw it. The walls were plain, the furniture simple, and the silence honest. Every morning, I woke up without a schedule designed by someone else. No assistants, no board meetings filled with fake smiles, no relatives calculating my worth based on usefulness. I built routines that belonged to me: long walks, handwritten notes, quiet research. While my family celebrated their new heir on magazine covers and charity galas, I disappeared from their narrative completely. And disappearance, I learned, is the first step toward control. Behind the scenes, I wasn't idle. I had spent years inside the family business, absorbing details they assumed I would never dare to use independently. I knew their weak partners, their unstable investments, their reliance on public perception. I also knew something more dangerous: how much of their empire was built on fragile trust rather than solid foundations. I didn't rush. I didn't announce myself. I watched. I learned. Calm people gather information while emotional people seek validation. News of my calmness began to reach them in fragments. My mother heard through a mutual acquaintance that I hadn't asked for money. My uncle learned I had declined a public interview. My cousins whispered that I hadn't spoken a single negative word about the family. That silence unsettled them more than any scandal could have. They wanted drama. They needed me to fail publicly so they could justify their betrayal privately. Instead, I gave them nothing. And nothing is terrifying when you expect chaos. The fake Heir, on the other hand, began to unravel quietly. Without comparison, his victory felt incomplete. He started mimicking my past decisions, repeating my ideas as if trying to prove he deserved the position. But imitation exposes insecurity. Executives noticed the difference. Partners felt the shift. Confidence built on replacement is always borrowed, and borrowed power expires quickly. I didn't have to interfere. Time did the work for me. Months passed, and opportunities appeared where I least expected them. Former contacts reached out cautiously, unsure of my standing. Investors who had been wary of my family's internal politics now saw me as neutral, independent, trustworthy. I never spoke about revenge. I spoke about vision, ethics, and long-term growth. Ironically, the traits my family labeled as weakness became my strongest currency. Where they ruled through fear, I attracted loyalty. Where they manipulated, I negotiated. The first real shift happened quietly, the way all meaningful changes do. A mid-sized firm backed by my family chose to withdraw from their partnership and collaborate with me instead. It wasn't dramatic enough to make headlines, but it was enough to be noticed. Then another followed. And another. Each decision was justified professionally, yet everyone understood the underlying message. I wasn't attacking my family, I was outgrowing them. When my father finally requested a meeting, it wasn't an order, it was an invitation. That difference mattered. The man who once assumed I would beg now spoke carefully, measuring his words. I agreed to meet him, not out of nostalgia, but out of curiosity. I wanted to see whether power had taught him humility, or whether he still believed bloodlines could control destiny. As I walked toward that meeting, I realized something important. This story was no longer about inheritance. It was about identity. They had taken my title, but I had taken my time. And time, when combined with clarity and patience, reshapes everything it touches. The meeting took place in a private lounge overlooking the city, glass walls reflecting a skyline my family once ruled without question. When I arrived, my father was already there, standing instead of sitting, a subtle sign of uncertainty he would never have shown before. He looked older than I remembered, not physically, but in the way authority weighed heavier on his shoulders. For the first time, I noticed something unsettling in his eyes, calculation mixed with restraint. He no longer spoke as a man issuing commands. He spoke as someone negotiating relevance. We exchanged formalities, nothing personal. He commented on my recent ventures, pretending casual interest while revealing how closely he had been watching. I listened, calm, composed, offering polite responses without validation. Silence, I had learned, forces people to reveal more than words ever could. Eventually, he mentioned the company that had shifted allegiance to me. He framed it as coincidence, but his clenched jaw betrayed concern. That partnership had been loyal to our family for over a decade. Loyalty breaking was not part of his script. Then came the question he had rehearsed. He asked whether my decisions were intentional or reactive, whether I was trying to prove something, whether this was about resentment. I smiled, the same calm smile that once unsettled the entire family. I told him the truth, but not the version he expected. I said my choices were neither emotional nor strategic against them. They were simply aligned with my values. Growth, I explained, doesn't require opposition, it requires direction. The more I spoke, the more I watched him realize that he no longer understood me. And that terrified him. He mentioned the fake Heir, carefully, as if testing unstable ground. He praised his performance, exaggerated his confidence, listed achievements that sounded impressive but felt hollow. I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct him. Letting someone defend a weak position exposes its cracks faster than confrontation ever could. When he finished, I nodded and said I was glad the family had found what they were looking for. The relief on his face lasted only a second before confusion replaced it. He had expected resistance, not acceptance. The conversation shifted. He began speaking about unity, about legacy, about the importance of standing together in uncertain times. That was when I understood the real reason for the meeting. It wasn't reconciliation. It was recruitment. My independence had become a variable they could no longer control, and uncontrolled variables threaten fragile systems. He wasn't asking me to return as an heir. He was asking me to stabilize what was already slipping. I declined gently. I said I respected the family's decision and believed consistency mattered. Reversing course would undermine their authority, and I wouldn't want that. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. I was protecting their image while refusing their power. His expression hardened, not with anger, but with realization. He had underestimated the consequences of replacing me. Not emotionally, but structurally. After the meeting, the city felt different. The streets were the same, the traffic unchanged, yet something fundamental had shifted. I was no longer reacting to my family's shadow. I had stepped fully into my own. News began circulating quietly that my ventures were outperforming expectations. Analysts praised the stability of my leadership. Employees spoke about trust, transparency, and vision, words rarely associated with my family's empire. Meanwhile, cracks formed faster than they could be hidden. The fake heir struggled under pressure. His decisions lacked depth. His authority relied on borrowed respect. Board members questioned him privately, then publicly. The same relatives who once applauded his appointment began distancing themselves, sensing risk. Wealth doesn't reward loyalty, it rewards survival. I watched from a distance, not with satisfaction, but with clarity. This wasn't revenge. It was consequence. When systems replace substance with appearance, collapse becomes inevitable. I hadn't engineered their instability. I had simply refused to support it. One evening, as I reviewed reports in my quiet apartment, I realized something that surprised even me. I felt no desire to reclaim what was taken. The empire that once defined me now felt small compared to the future I was building. They had chosen a fake heir to preserve control. Instead, they had freed the real one. And freedom, once tasted, cannot be inherited, it must be earned. The collapse didn't arrive with sirens or headlines. It crept in quietly, disguised as routine. Missed deadlines. Delayed approvals. Partners asking questions that had never been asked before. From the outside, my family's empire still looked flawless, but internally, the rhythm was off. The fake heir was reacting instead of leading, and reaction is the first confession of weakness. People sensed it. Markets always do. I didn't celebrate these signs. I documented them. Power isn't loud when it's real, it's observant. My name began surfacing in conversations I wasn't present for. Executives compared leadership styles. Investors discussed long-term trust versus short-term dominance. Employees who once feared my family's authority now spoke openly about sustainability and ethics. The irony was sharp. The qualities they rejected in me were now the standards others demanded. I had become a reference point without asking to be one. That kind of influence doesn't announce itself, it spreads. Then came the gala. The same charity event where my family had publicly crowned the fake heir months earlier. This time, I attended, not as a guest of the family, but as an independent figure invited by multiple boards. When I entered the hall, conversations paused. Not dramatically, just long enough to be noticed. My family stood together across the room, polished and tense. The fake heir smiled too quickly. My father's eyes followed me, not with pride, but with calculation. We didn't speak that night. We didn't need to. Presence can be louder than confrontation. I spoke with partners, advisors, and journalists who once avoided me. No bitterness, no accusations. Just clarity. The fake heir watched from a distance, measuring himself against a standard he couldn't meet. Comparison is cruel when it's unavoidable. A week later, the board fractured. Votes were split. Confidence wavered. Decisions stalled. My father called again, this time without pretense. He spoke about crisis, about reputation, about responsibility. He asked whether I would step in temporarily, discreetly, to restore balance. Not as heir. Not publicly. Just as support. The request said everything his words didn't. I refused again, kindly. I explained that stability built on concealment eventually collapses. That leadership cannot be borrowed without cost. That choosing a symbol over substance has consequences no one can quietly undo. He listened in silence. For the first time, he didn't argue. Authority had finally taught him humility, but too late to negotiate terms. The fake heir resigned 3 days later. Officially, it was for personal reasons. Unofficially, everyone knew. His departure wasn't mourned, it was managed. The family scrambled to contain damage, issuing statements, shifting blame, rewriting narratives. I watched as they tried to repair trust they themselves had broken. Trust, once fractured, doesn't respond to pressure, it responds to proof. Offers poured in afterward. Advisory roles. Strategic partnerships. Even media requests framing me as the rightful successor. I declined titles and corrected narratives. This story was never about reclaiming a throne. It was about proving that character outlasts inheritance. I chose autonomy over validation, and in doing so, rewrote the rules they thought were permanent. One evening, my mother visited unannounced. No entourage. No script. She looked smaller without the protection of certainty. She didn't apologize directly. She spoke about fear, about pressure, about choosing safety over faith. I listened. Understanding doesn't require agreement. Before leaving, she said something that stayed with me. She said, "We thought breaking you would protect us." I replied calmly, "You didn't break me. You revealed yourselves." As the year closed, my family's empire stabilized, smaller and quieter. Mine expanded, deliberate and resilient. Different structures. Different values. Different future. I hadn't won against them. I had moved beyond them. And that realization was the most unsettling outcome of all, for them. Because empires fear collapse, but they fear irrelevance even more. And irrelevance is what happens when control replaces trust, when image replaces integrity, and when a real heir is mistaken for a liability. By the time everything settled, the noise had faded. No press conferences. No dramatic apologies. Just a quiet reshaping of reality. My family's name still existed, but it no longer carried the weight it once did. Influence diluted. Authority questioned. Meanwhile, my own path grew steadier, defined not by reaction but by intention. I had learned something crucial through the process. True power doesn't rush to be acknowledged. It allows others to discover it too late. People often assume victory looks like dominance, but mine looked like distance. I stopped checking updates about my family. Not out of bitterness, but because they no longer defined my trajectory. I focused on building systems that didn't depend on fear or legacy. Teams that chose me rather than feared me. Partners who valued transparency over intimidation. Slowly, unmistakably, my work spoke for itself. And when success arrived, it didn't feel explosive, it felt inevitable. One afternoon, I received an invitation to a conference where my father was also scheduled to speak. Different panels. Different reputations. Different futures. When we crossed paths backstage, there was no hostility, just recognition. He looked at me not as a son who disobeyed, but as a man who surpassed expectation. He didn't congratulate me. He didn't need to. Regret has its own language, and I understood it perfectly. Later that evening, I stood on stage addressing an audience that once would have ignored me. I spoke about leadership without inheritance, about resilience without revenge, about the danger of mistaking compliance for competence. I never mentioned my family. I didn't have to. Some stories don't need names to be understood. When the applause ended, I felt something rare: completion. Not triumph. Closure. In private moments, I reflected on the version of myself they expected to destroy. The heir who would beg. The son who would crumble. The man who would define himself by rejection. That version never existed. Calmness had always been my strength. I just hadn't known it yet. While they mistook restraint for weakness, I was learning endurance. While they searched for control, I was building clarity. The fake heir disappeared from relevance entirely. Not disgraced, not redeemed, just forgotten. And that, I realized, was the most honest ending. Power borrowed without identity has no place to return to. I didn't take his place. I eliminated the need for one. On the anniversary of the day I was replaced, I visited the old estate one last time. Not to confront, not to reclaim, just to acknowledge the chapter's end. The house looked the same, but it felt different. Smaller. Quieter. Like a monument to decisions that once seemed permanent. I left without regret. Some doors don't close, they simply stop mattering. My story didn't go viral because of revenge. It resonated because of restraint. People saw themselves in it, the overlooked, the underestimated, the ones expected to break. They saw that calm isn't surrender. Silence isn't defeat. Walking away isn't loss. Sometimes, it's strategy. Sometimes, it's survival. And sometimes, it's the beginning of something greater than inheritance ever promised. I was never fighting to be chosen. I was learning to choose myself. And that choice rewrote everything. Because in the end, my rich family did choose a fake heir over me. They expected me to break, to beg, to collapse under the weight of their rejection. Instead, I stayed calm. And that calmness didn't just shock them, it outgrew them.